Lecture 3, Politics and Revolutions. The heightened scientific development in the Western world covered in the previous lecture has been called a revolution. In this lecture, we will be studying actual revolutions that were not simply confined to how the human mind perceives reality. First, we will discuss the American Revolution, and then we will examine the French Revolution. Interspersed in our examination of these two political revolutions will be references to key philosophers of those times whose ideas helped to influence Western political reality, namely Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We will conclude this lecture with romantic art that roughly was an expression of revolutionary sentiment. American Revolution. In September of 1774, 55 delegates from 12 British colonies, the colony of Georgia was absent, met at Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress to decide how to respond to the British Parliament's passing of the Coercive Acts. The British Parliament passed the 1774 Coercive Acts as a way to punish the colonists' rebellious actions, especially for the incident known as the Boston Tea Party. Included in the acts was the closing the Boston port until tea destroyed by American colonists was compensated for. During the Boston Tea Party incident of December 16, 1773, colonists protested the British Tea Act of 1773, which allowed the British East India Company to sell its tea duty-free to the colonies. Dressed up as American Indians, colonists boarded British ships, docked in Boston, proceeded to throw the British tea into the ocean. In throwing the tea into Boston Harbor, the colonists were not only expressing their anger against the Tea Act, but also against a similar act passed by the British Parliament in 1765, the Stamp Act. According to the Stamp Act, if colonists wished to print on paper, they were required to first purchase officially stamped paper manufactured in England. By 1775, 13 colonies had mutually rejected the authority of the British Parliament on the grounds that the American colonies were being governed without representation. They then began governing themselves with provincial congresses and a continental congress. Not surprisingly, the British responded to colonies by sending in troops. In 1775, the American Revolutionary War had begun. Soon afterwards, on July 4, 1776, the American Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, was officially promulgated by the Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence explicitly refers to God and a moral law that is reflective of his nature. George Washington, as commander, led the American side to victory. Very likely, American victory would not have been possible without the help of the French. In 1778, the French, who had been long-time rivals of Britain, agreed to help the Americans both on land and on sea. The decisive 1781 defeat of the British at Yorktown, Virginia, was completed by a coalition of American and French forces. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the British admitted defeat to their former colonies. Within a decade, a number of foundational U.S. documents were written and approved of, in particular the 1788 U.S. Constitution that replaced the former Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, and the 1791 U.S. Bill of Rights, which consists of the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Since then, 17 additional amendments to the U.S. Constitution have been added. Now that we have covered the essential events of the American Revolution, we will turn to two key philosophers who influenced the early formation of American thought on government, John Locke and Montesquieu. John Locke lived from 1632 to 1704. He was an influential philosopher for the leaders of the American colonists who rose up in revolt against the British, that he has been named as the philosopher of the American Revolution. Locke's Two Treatises of Government was a particularly influential work. Another influential work was his An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And in the transcript, I provide excerpts from John Locke so that you can compare and contrast, or actually compare, that with the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Montesquieu. The French attorney and philosopher Montesquieu, lived from 1689 to 1755, theorized on a political system made up of three relatively distinct powers that check and balance one another. The three powers that Montesquieu separated from one another in order for each to check the other two are as follows: executive, legislative, and judicial. The American political system reflects his thought by granting executive power to the president, judicial power to the courts, and legislative power to the two houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Philosophy of the French Revolution. As Locke's ideas served as the philosophy of the American Revolution and the founding fathers of the U.S., Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas served as the philosophy of the French Revolution. The historian Jonathan Steinberg, in reference to the founding days of the U.S., asserts that Rousseau's idea of a social contract, that Rousseau refers to in The Social Contract, with the general will as its basis, and I quote, was precisely what the founding fathers of the U.S. rejected, and the Constitution of 1787 was designed to prevent such a democracy, not encourage it. End of quote. According to the German philosopher Hannah Arendt, Rousseau's idea of a general will was specifically adopted by French revolutionaries, who, in order to establish a single political will, violently killed those who did not agree with their mandated political will. And in the transcript, I provide you with two passages. The first passage is on the idea of a general will written by Rousseau in 1762, which was adopted by the revolutionary writers of France's 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. What do you think Rousseau meant by forcing citizens to be free? And he explicitly states that. As explained by Cahoon, Rousseau is basing this concept on his division between a lower self and a higher true self. The higher true self is determined by general will. Notice, not by the intellect, but by the general will. People will only be truly free, according to Rousseau, if they follow their higher self, determined by the general will. Similarly, as drug addicts experience true freedom when they follow their higher self that does not want to choose drugs. However, in the case of drug addicts, they are experiencing their true freedom because they're following a higher self that is in accordance with reason. The four governments of the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, France was governed by four distinct ruling bodies: the National Constituent Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, the National Convention, and the Directory. We will begin with the National Constituent Assembly. Prior to the National Constituent Assembly, France was ruled by the absolute monarch King Louis XVI, who was referred to along with his wife Marie Antoinette in a previous lecture. In order to disadvantage England, whom the French viewed as a competitor, King Louis XVI agreed to financially back the Americans during the American Revolutionary War, but only when he was convinced he was backing the winning side. Interestingly, by so doing, he prepared the way for his own power to be undermined. This was because the heroic fight of the American colonists to rid themselves of being ruled by a British King George III inspired French people to overthrow their own king. In addition, in order to help the Americans, King Louis XVI put his country into further debt, thus giving more reasons for his people to dislike him and to revolt against him. After the Americans, in part relying on French financial resources, had successfully defeated the British, King Louis XVI set about finding ways to pay off French debt that had become exacerbated by a season of poor crops and inflated food prices. In 1789, he called together a political body, inactive since 1614, called the States General. The States General consisted of three estates: First Estate, clergy; Second Estate, nobles; and Third Estate, made up of lawyers, businessmen, and peasants. On June 15th of 1789, the members, including the clergy, voted to change the name from the States General to the National Assembly. The name change was done in order to indicate that the National Assembly was autonomous from the king. Not surprisingly, the king and his council responded 5 days later on June 20th, 1789 by locking out the assembly members from the building they were holding meetings in. In great anger, The assembly members, joined by a majority of the clergy representatives and 3 nobles, held their scheduled meeting in a nearby tennis court. At the tennis court, the assembly solemnly swore a tennis court oath in which they reaffirmed that France's ruling body was the National Assembly of France and not the king and his council. Soon after the tennis court oath was taken, King Louis XVI fired his finance minister Jacques Necker. The firing of Necker further incited French people against the king, since Necker, who had advocated increasing the Third Estate's representation, was believed to be on the side of the poor. In response to Necker's firing, out of frustration for the high cost of food and an irritation over the stalemate in government, Parisians began rioting and looting. Their mayhem peaked when a mob attacked the Bastille state prison on July 14, 1789. There, the mob set free the Bastille's 7 prisoners, and they were a nobleman, 2 severely mentally ill people, and 4 forgers. In an irrational frenzy, the mob murdered the governor of Bastille, murdered the city's chief magistrate, chopped off both of their heads, and proceeded to parade around with the heads of the governor and magistrate stuck on pikes. Cooler-minded revolutionaries set about to fundamentally change the laws of France. In August of 1789, the National Constituent Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which we covered previously. During the following year of 1790, the National Constituent Assembly turned against another group of people, the Catholic clergy, whom they classified as favoring the king and his aristocrats. In order to repress Catholicism in France, the Assembly prohibited the profession of monastic vows and issued a civil constitution of the clergy. According to this constitution, clergy were to be paid by public funds, priests and bishops were to be elected by the people, and all clerics were to swear an oath of obedience to the Constitution. Other anti-church legislation passed during the reign of the Assembly included ending in 1789 the tithe, or tax that was given to the church, and the 1789 authorization to sell off Catholic Church land in order to grow the coffers of the revolutionary French government. The Legislative Assembly. In 1791, the Legislative Assembly that replaced the National Constituent Assembly set about persecuting the Catholic Church with even greater intensity. Religious orders that either taught or worked in hospitals were suppressed. The state replaced the church's civic responsibility of keeping registers of births, marriages, and deaths. Clerical attire was forbidden. Church funds and property were seized by the government, and priests who refused to take an oath of fidelity to the Constitution were, if captured, imprisoned or even killed. Within about a year's time, the second governing body began fracturing apart. The reason was that the 3 political parties that made up the Legislative Assembly began fighting one another. One party supported inherited royal power. Another party wanted royal power to be gradually checked. And the third party wanted to suddenly change the government by eliminating the last remaining features of inherited royal power. The latter party, the Jacobins, and most radical of the 3 parties, overpowered the other 2 to form yet another governing body, the National Convention. And it lasted from 1792 to 1795. After gaining control of the French government, the Jacobins issued inclusive voting laws for how representatives to the National Convention were to be chosen. Previously, during the reign of the Legislative Assembly, only wealthy landowners were allowed to be electors. Once these electors were chosen by general population vote, they then voted who would be the nation's representatives. The National Convention also greatly reduced the power of the wealthy and aristocratic by abolishing King Louis XVI's rule, which had been suspended. Once King Louis XVI was removed from office, the National Convention charged him with high treason and placed him on trial. The king's failed attempt to flee France in June of 1791 convinced the court of his guilt by a verdict that passed by only 1 vote. On January 21, 1793, the king was guillotined. Upon hearing the French king's execution, England, the Dutch Republic, Italian states, and Spain joined the Holy Roman Emperor in a war against France. A few months later, on October 16, 1793, Queen Marie Antoinette was also guillotined, but not before she underwent a brutal character assassination campaign. She was accused of being a lesbian, of being completely uncaring for the poor of France. Even today, a phrase indicating her coldness is still unjustly attributed to her: "Let them eat cake." There is no documentary proof that the Queen ever said these harsh words. The same year that the Queen was executed, a horrific time began, the Reign of Terror, spearheaded by the attorney Maximilien de Robespierre. During the Reign of Terror, the number of people executed after trial was around 17,000. with an additional 30 to 40,000 executions without a trial. In the last months of the Reign of Terror, the rate of people being guillotined in Paris alone was 30 per day. Besides the guillotine, other efficient methods of killing people were devised, including mass executions before cannon fire and mass drowning, where boats crammed with people would be sunk and then refloated in order to add more people for drowning. Practicing Catholics made up many of the state's victims. The French state also directed its hatreds towards Catholicism by destroying Catholic signs. Confessionals, altars, statues, and crosses were destroyed, and precious metals from these Catholic symbols were melted down in order to increase the state's financial holdings. Near the end of the Reign of Terror, on July 17th, 1794, the state publicly guillotined 16 members of the Carmelite convent of Compiègne on the charge of keeping a convent open. In their convent, these sisters, who have since been beatified, had been daily offering themselves to God so that peace would be restored to France and the Reign of Terror would end. As they walked to be guillotined, they prayed out loud the Salve Regina and Psalm 117, "Praise the Lord of all people." Their executions helped to awaken the consciences of many French people. A few weeks after the deaths, the architect of death, Robespierre, was executed on orders of the Convention, signaling an end to the Reign of Terror. Those who ordered Robespierre to be executed then set about forming a new government, the Directory, which lasted from 1795 to 1799. The Directory consisted of 5 men, who shared an executive power so as to prevent one man, like Robespierre, from concentrating all power in himself. Under the Directory's rule, anti-Catholic persecution continued, but in a more subdued manner. One notable exception was the war in the Vendée that had begun under the time of the National Convention and was concluded under the Directory. Contrary to the state's anti-Catholic legislation, the predominantly Catholic population of Vendée had insisted on openly practicing Catholicism. During the French government's crackdown of this civil disobedience, around 200,000 people died. Romanticism. The art that accompanied the revolutionary sentiment of this era is known as Romanticism. Romantic art was a reaction to the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, law, and exact scientific reasoning. According to many artists, what had been ignored by many Enlightenment thinkers were human emotions. They therefore began creating a new form of art that exalted emotion, spontaneity, the awesome forces of nature, dreams, love, and even the once overlooked reality and art of insanity and tragedy. In accordance with Rousseau, the philosopher of the French Revolution, the Romantics believed, explains Jansen, quote, that evil would disappear if people were only to behave naturally and give their impulses free rein. End of quote. Romanticism was expressed in a variety of artistic medium. In music, the son of J.S. Bach, C.P.E. Bach, embraced this style. C.P.E. Bach is not only representative of early musical Romanticism, but also represents a shift in how art was appreciated. The new art of C.P.E. Bach's time, art was composed to express the interior emotions of the artist, with the hope that those who heard it, primarily the new middle class, would identify with emotions and buy the music. In contrast, traditional music, as represented by J.S. Bach, who composed all his music for the greater glory of God, was directed to God and rulers who represented his authority. By 1770, C.P.E. Bach had successfully marketed his art by mail. Approaching art as a commodity on the marketplace significantly differs from his father's. His father, a devout Lutheran, was concerned with representing the truth of God so as to bring people to worship. One way that J.S. Bach did this was by incorporating mathematical truth, such as the Fibonacci series, into his compositions. His son and others distanced themselves from this manner of composing by developing a theory of emotions called the doctrine of the emotions. And I'll just mention a few romantic artists, painters. J.M.W. Turner was an English romantic artist. John Constable was also an English romantic artist. Thomas Gainsbourg was yet another English portrait artist. Caspar David Friedrich was a romantic artist from Germany. Thomas Cole was an American romantic artist. Painted a beautiful painting called The Oxbow of the Connecticut River. Albert Bierstadt was a German-American romantic artist. He painted in Central California, the Yosemite Valley. Frederick Edwin Church, American artist, painted beautiful landscapes, including of the Niagara Falls. And Anne-Louise Trisson was a French romantic artist. Henry Fuseli was a Swiss romantic artist. He painted a very interesting painting on an irrational nightmare. And William Blake was an English romantic poet and painter. Francis Goya was a Spanish romantic painter of the time. He also he's known for painting an emotionally tense painting of Napoleon-led French army which executed Spaniards, and this is titled The 3rd of May. Theodore Géricault was a French romantic painter, and one painting called The Raft of the Medusa is a depiction of an actual tragedy at sea from his times. Ferdinand Victor Eugène Delacroix was a French romantic painter, and he painted a painting that brims over with revolutionary sentiment titled Liberty Leading People. God bless.